Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The futile waste of life in the Russian-Ukrainian war continues unabated as its consequences, combined with Western sanctions, expedite the global economy's collapse. And it's only going to get worse. Europe has essentially ceded its decision-making to the US warmongers flooding Ukraine with weapons, guaranteeing that this war goes on. But Ukraine isn't the only major event reshaping the global order. Another senseless massacre of children in the US, a European embargo on Russian oil, the US flexing its muscles to intimidate China, global inflation, ongoing pandemics, geopolitical realignments, sandstorms devastating Iraq for months, a possible victory for the left in Colombia, massive protests in Sri Lanka amid severe fuel and food shortages. It feels as though we're watching the world order crumble without any clear alternatives emerging. So how do we understand all these disparate events? To help make sense of it all, I'm joined by Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and author of many books, including Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA, Coups, and Assassinations. Vijay, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be with you, Rania.
It's always so good to have you on, especially because I feel like you're one of those voices that can really take all of these things like happening around us and actually like help contextualize it and give us like a narrative to understand it all. So I know that's a lot of pressure to put on you, but I guess a good place to start here, would be maybe with the latest news related to the war in Ukraine. We hear that EU leaders have agreed to this ban on Russian oil, arriving to them by sea by the end of this year, which would cut off like 2/3 of the EU's total imports of oil. But they don't seem to have an actual replacement yet for this oil. So I say all that to ask, why would the Europeans do this to themselves? It seems like every decision they make in this war is shooting themselves in the foot, hurting their own security, hurting their own population, causing crazy inflation in their own countries. So what does this mean for Europe? Why are they doing all these things that are going to ultimately harm their countries? And what does it also mean, do you think, for global oil prices moving forward?
Well, it's really an interesting issue that you've raised about the Europeans. So maybe we should just start there. Early on, when the United States first broached the question of the ban on Russian oil and natural gas into Europe, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made it very clear to Joe Biden that, look, this is not going to be possible immediately. Germany relies for about a third of its oil and natural gas on Russian supplies. That's a very large amount coming from one supplier. And Mr. Scholz said, we might be able to reduce it to 12% from 30%. But this, of course, means that Germany is going to slow down on its green pledge, to get rid of coal, to also shutter German nuclear power plants. Germany had pledged to do all those things. So in order to come from 30% reliance on Russian energy, Germany had said we'll come to 12%. It's very much impossible to imagine anything beyond that, less than 12%. And Olaf Scholz made a comment, Rania, which was very clear. Olaf Scholz said, look, if we go to zero, then we will plunge Germany into a serious depression. Now, that's important. I actually believe that the world economy has been in a depression for a long time. It's a technical debate, about so many quarters of lack of growth and so on. Certainly, according to the Financial Times, the world economy has entered a period of stagflation. That means stagnation. That's how the stag part of stagflation, stagnation. GDP has dropped dramatically. We're not seeing a growth in GDP. This is there in the last IMF report. This is there in the data that the World Bank keeps and so on. GDP has collapsed. And at the same time, there is a rise of inflation. So the combination of the collapse of growth of gross domestic product, that's the stagflation part of it, and then there's the stagnation part of it, and then the rise of inflation. These two things together are actually very perilous for the world economy because prices are going up and the pie, as it were, is not growing, which means that because there's a mismatch between goods that are available and big high demand for them, prices will go even further up. That means we haven't seen the back of inflation, even though in some countries there's an argument being made that inflation has peaked. For instance, Bloomberg made that argument about the United States, that we're nearing peak inflation in the US. That's what Bloomberg said. So okay, so you've got this terrible situation, global situation of stagflation. Again, it's my view that the stagflation is not caused by the war in Ukraine, nor is the stagflation actually caused by the pandemic by itself. There were long-term trends that demonstrated, crises and problems in the world economy. But yes, the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine were, in a sense, triggers for the rise of prices and for the decline of growth. They certainly triggered it. So here you have the German chancellor saying, look, we're in a major crisis. We can't afford to cut off energy. Actually, Rania, something else is being said here, which is that the Germans and other Europeans understand that the integration of Europe with Asia is inevitable. I mean, Russia has not only enormous pools of energy, but also lots of rare earth minerals and other precious metals and so on that are key for the modern economy. Russia is the largest landmass country in the world, and a large part of it is got enormous old mines going back to the coal mines and so on, but also, as I said, these exotic rare earth minerals. So the integration of, say, German high-tech economy with Russian energy and Chinese labor has become fundamental to Germany. The United States is trying to, in a sense, break the inevitable integration of Europe to Asia. And Europe has gone along with this US project, even though it's against the tide of history. So what I just want to say to wrap this up is that the tide of history suggests the natural integration of Europe into Asia. It's cheaper to get energy from Russia. It's easier to utilize labor from China and Russia and other Eastern European countries. That's more natural than to rely on energy from the United States, having to liquefy natural gas, or energy from the Gulf, again, liquefy natural gas, very expensive, big carbon footprint, and so on. This natural integration of Eurasia is what the United States is trying to prevent. And that's really the conundrum Europe is finding itself in. And European leaders simply have shown that they either don't have the guts to go along with the real tide of history, or that they are committed to an Atlantic project. And if they do integrate with Russia, they want to integrate on their terms. So you see, US foreign policy experts talk about the breakup of Russia. Let's break up Russia into many little countries, and then we'll be able to dominate Russian resources. So they understand the inevitable integration, not on the terms of equality, but on the terms of essentially colonizing Russia.
It's that European mentality that, of course, like America has taken on. But it is amazing to watch, not just Europe, but the US. You're talking about how there's this stagflation, how there was already signs of problems in the global economy even before COVID, and then COVID and now this war have made it worse. But this war has made it worse, right? You see inflation in the US. I was in the States like last month, and everything was so expensive. Everything from just like, your average like toiletry to food to gasoline to, I mean, everything. It just like, but you feel the squeeze. And then, we see today, like there's this news out about the Eurozone. It's reporting an 8.6% inflation, which is reportedly the highest that's ever had since the creation of the euro in 1999. So ultimately, you say that the US and, of course, Europe as sort of like the US lapdog is doing this to prevent European integration, which is natural, right, with Asia. But at the same time, how much are they going to hurt themselves in order to do this? Like, yes, the US is, of course, immune from a lot of the sort of ricochet effects of this war, but not entirely. And if there is a global recession that is triggered by this, the kind of recession that like economists would recognize as a recession, then that would be devastating for everyone. So why do you think they're willing to put up with this just to prevent, I guess, this integration you're talking about, and how far are they willing to go?
Well, there's a theory, okay? I don't subscribe to this theory, but there's a theory in Washington that some senior foreign policy analysts that sit around the beltway, the kind of the
Worst
talking
people in the
heads
world.
that make policy in Washington, D.C., they have a theory. And this theory has actually been around for a long time. I remember encountering it around the lead up to the second war on Iraq in 2002, 2003, when the debates were taking place about whether the United States should accelerate its war in Iraq. Because frankly, there was only one war in Iraq. It starts in 1991 and goes all the way, to some extent till 2007. Okay, during that debate, people were making the argument that we can tolerate, that is, we, meaning I don't know who, them, the United States, the West, we can tolerate short term pain for long term gain. It's an interesting argument. I don't subscribe to it because I actually don't think it works out well. Didn't work out very well with Iraq because, after all, the idea was to go in, overthrow Saddam Hussein, and then put in Ahmad Chalabi and others, perhaps to in fact break up Iraq into three provinces, the old provinces of the Ottoman Empire, the northern province, let's call it the Kurdish state, then a central province, and then a southern province, Basra, Baghdad, and then Basra, something like that. Well, it didn't work out. In fact, in many ways, the United States lost the war in Iraq. Its war aims were not realized. Okay, but there's this theory of you can tolerate short-term pain for long-term gain, and that's the phrase that they use. Okay, so the idea is that they don't want to see either China by itself or China in alliance with Russia emerge as major players in the world with their own sovereignty, their own agenda, their own attempt to drive a program regarding integration with Europe or Africa or Southern Asia and so on. That you don't want to see China and Russia as equal partners in world affairs, but you would like to, in a sense, accelerate a conflict with China and Russia. And then, now to quote from Lloyd Austin, US Secretary of Defense, you want to weaken Russia, which the more extreme people talk about the breakup of Russia. Excuse me. You want to weaken Russia, or as I said, the more extreme people want to weaken Russia, break it up, and so on. And then you can better dominate Russia's resources, the range of resources that Russia has. The head of them all, of course, is energy. Same with China. There are sections in the United States that would like to see regime change in China. They don't actually want to put China and Russia onto a SpaceX spacecraft and send them off to Mars. They want to retain the resources, the human capacity of Russia and China, but they want to subordinate it to US Western interests. And so, in a sense, in my view, strangely, there is this argument that they have that we can tolerate this short-term gain, meaning there'll be inflation, there'll be some global turbulence, there may even be a nuclear strike against Russia, and so on. But then Russia will collapse. This time, what they couldn't accomplish with Yeltsin, this time with Boris Yeltsin, who took over in Russia 1991 to 1999, what they didn't accomplish with Yeltsin, which was the breakup, the dismemberment of Russia, in the same way as they dismembered Yugoslavia, this time they'll dismember Russia, maybe even dismember China, break it up in some way, and then be able to dominate the Asian continent. So you won't have Eurasian integration on an equal footing. You'll have, again, a kind of recolonization of the Asian continent. And so, again, short-term pain. I mean, who's taking the pain? That's a real issue. It's the poor,
that's a good
middle
point.
class, and so on. And then long-term gain. Who's going to gain? It's going to be multinational corporations. It'll be, the SpaceXs and so on, because they'll get access to exotic rare earth minerals that are in abundance in Central Asia and in Russia, which are under the kind of dominion right now of the Russian state. And
Right.
so that is what I feel is driving some of this sort of madman theory of world affairs. And I want to underline this. This is back to Nixon's madman type theory. This is the United States saying that in order to maintain dominance, we are willing to go to places that reasonable, sane people, and I saw you rolling your eyes when I said, they might have a nuclear strike and so on. That's because reasonable people think that's nuts. But in a sense, they are willing to do
Yeah.
this. This is the short term pain for long term gain.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's so stunning to me, like the lunacy of these people. But you make an excellent point that when they talk about short-term pain, it's not them feeling the pain. It's like all those like rich celebrities and politicians being like, it's okay if we pay a little bit more at the pump because freedom isn't free. And it's like, but it doesn't matter if you pay a little bit more because you can afford it. Nobody else can. Um, that said, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while obviously like provoked by NATO expansion, is also fueling further NATO expansion with Sweden and Finland rushing to join NATO. Why do you think a country would join NATO after watching the consequences of that on Ukraine, which is Russia's invasion? Not that I'm saying Russia would invade Finland and Sweden. I actually don't think that they would, or that Sweden and Finland would actually be as big a security risk for Russia as Ukraine joining. But if you're a smaller country, like why would you do that, especially after witnessing how NATO isn't even intervening to protect Ukraine? They're just like giving Ukraine weapons so that Ukrainians can like fling themselves at Russia. And what do you think will be the impact of Sweden and Finland joining NATO? Does that even matter?
Well, I was interested in the conversation, Rania, about how Sweden and Finland are relatively neutral countries that are now sort of breaking their neutrality. It's true that Switzerland, also a country that is claimed to be neutral. I don't know how neutral a country can be if it's the repository of Nazi gold and then all the stolen funds from US-backed dictators like Mobutu Seko Seke and so on. I mean, I've always been cautious about considering Switzerland neutral. Not that neutral during World War II, and so on. It helped in the pipeline of Nazis to escape Europe and go to South America. That's not neutral. But let's let that be. Sweden and Finland as well, their neutrality is hardly that clear. During the entirety of the Cold War, they operated in a Western way, as it were. They allowed for the United States to have listening stations there. They were directly there. Sweden, provided weapons systems. It's one of the major weapons exporters per capita. It's one of the big weapons exporters. Gives the Nobel Peace Prize, but actually exports weapons. I mean, one of the most powerful battlefield guns, the howitzer made by Bofors. That's a Swedish company. Bofors guns are available to militaries all over the world. So I don't know, and even small arms, which are actually the most deadly weapons produced in Sweden. So the neutrality of the Swedes and the Finns, it should actually be taken with a grain of salt. I think that what has occurred are a couple of things. One is, isn't it interesting that if you pick up any European newspaper, whether it's the papers in Germany or it's in Britain, you look at papers in Italy and so on, there is a suffocating consensus about the war that's taking place in Ukraine, a suffocating consensus. This consensus has suggested to populations in Europe, including in Finland and in Sweden, this suffocating consensus has basically created a atmosphere where people feel like Russia is going to drive its tanks all the way to Lisbon, and Paris and so on. I mean, I write a regular column for a Norwegian newspaper, Klassenkampen, and the editor there, says to me that even in their paper, which is a left-wing paper, there's a constant debate about what's happening in Ukraine. And, the editor said to me, look, for your column this month, don't write about Ukraine, please. Write about something else. So I wrote about NATO's expansion into Africa. Maybe it's a little mischievous thing to do, but there it is. but the atmosphere in Europe is so deeply, in a sense, petrified about this sort of Russian expansionism and so on, that people will do all kinds of things. Public opinion polls in Sweden and Finland are showing majorities of people wanting to join NATO. I mean, there are British people who were formerly on the left, even, and I need not name them because why should we name people like that, who are basically a kind of left flank for NATO, writing long medium articles saying NATO needs to have a better human rights policy and so on. There's an extraordinary way in which there's this overwhelming fear of Russian tanks going all the way into France, and there's this incredible hope and expectation and belief that NATO is a human rights organization. These two things in combination have increased these majorities of this in countries like Finland and Sweden, but even in other European countries, have increased feeling for NATO. NATO is going to go into the Madrid summit this summer. NATO has its meeting in Madrid this summer. In June, they're going to go into this meeting. I can tell you, the Secretary General of NATO is going to walk around, bouncing on his toes, because he feels now like, the next Nobel Prize for Peace is going to come to NATO and to the Secretary General of NATO, given by the Swedes, who will then join in. I mean, I'm telling you, this is a breaking news prediction. The next Nobel Prize for Peace is either going to go to Mr. Zelensky, or Mr. Zelensky and the Secretary General of NATO combined.
Wow. Yeah, that's actually a frightening prospect. But then again, Joe Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize and then he like drone bombed everything. So it might be fitting. But that said, given everything you just said, you talked about this kind of suffocating narrative in Europe. I think a part of that narrative is also that the Ukrainians are maybe winning, which, in recent days, maybe like the last week, there have been reports about how actually, contrary to that rosy picture we've been getting for the last 3 months, before about Ukraine winning this war against all odds, the Ukrainians like uniting together to take on the Russians. Actually, the Ukrainians aren't actually united. They're dying in huge numbers, which we don't actually know the specific number because this is per the New York Times. Ukrainian deaths are considered a state secret because it makes them look bad, I guess, which makes sense. And there are reports now, like there was a big piece in the Washington Post, I'm sure you saw it, that, about Ukrainian fighters on the front lines, particularly in the East, having like one meal a day. A lot of them, like half or more of like the units there have either died or fled because the conditions are so terrible and they're getting crushed by the Russians. So basically, you see the mainstream media in the US starting to maybe a little bit acknowledge that it's not so rosy. It's not so, that the Ukrainians are winning, Russians are losing. You even have the NYT editorial board getting a bit skeptical about whether this war should go on for much longer. You have figures like Henry Kissinger being attacked for saying it's essentially like a stupid war. So it seems like maybe some tiny segment of the ruling class is like reality is maybe sinking in for them a little bit. I don't know. And then, of course, like maybe Putin's invasion did initially unify Ukrainians, but it's becoming clearer based on some of the testimony by those people who are fighting in Ukraine that like the rich and powerful oligarchy in Ukraine aren't the ones dying. They are. And we have to remember Ukraine is or was, and I guess still is, one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. It has one of the highest levels of inequality. That's all to say, I know we're not military experts here, but what's your interpretation of perhaps some of these cracks in the mainstream narrative on this war? And is it really as simple as Russia's losing horribly and maybe the Ukrainians have a chance to win?
Well, look, again, I'm not a military expert, and I just digest things and understand things and so on. And I would say that when the war began, the Russians entered Ukraine from three directions. One was from the Donbass, Lugansk border, and they entered from there and down towards Mariupol. They came north out of Crimea, and they came south from Belarus. Those were, in a sense, the three directions in which they entered. Now, what I found very interesting is that the early on, it's probably true that toward the northern areas of Kiev, the Russian army could not advance as quickly as maybe they thought. Um, I talked to some people, reporters who were in Ukraine, and they suggested that maybe that was another kind of ploy by the Russians, that perhaps they were not interested in entering Kiev and going, you know, street by street fighting, because that's a big city. It's not easy to take Kiev, and if you enter Kiev, maybe Poland would get involved and so on. So maybe they just wanted territory in the north. Why? Because the real goal, it seemed to me, was to both absorb Lugansk and Donetsk, and to build that land bridge to Crimea that would go through Mariupol. And perhaps the northern invasion was to hold territory in order for a territory swap during the negotiations, to take a lot of territory in the north and then build the land bridge, which is now substantially built, going through Mariupol, which is the second biggest port after Sevastopol. To build that land bridge, they would say, look, we're not going to release that land bridge, we're not going to give you that land back, but we'll withdraw from the north. Maybe that was the case. I don't know. I'm not privy to Russian military secrets and plans and so on. But look, frankly, wars are hard. I mean, I've covered wars, they are difficult. Militaries don't advance even when they have overwhelming superiority. Saw that in Afghanistan. United States didn't have an easy time, because you'd advance, say, 20 kilometers, and then nightfall comes, and then you try to consolidate your hold, and maybe you do hold a lot of territory, but then you get hit by, guerrilla fire. You get either 5, 6 fellows come in a daring way and attack your camp, or you get bazooka fire and mortar fire and so on, and then you face a retreat and you take losses. The United States faced that in Afghanistan from the Taliban, who were, a ragtag bunch of people who were not getting $40 billion from the United States for weaponry. In a sense, we saw this in Iraq directly, saw this in Syria, where the Syrian military, highly disciplined military, would advance into the Kalamun mountains and then face, the fighting from these Al-Qaeda forces, which would keep pushing them back. The Syrian army would have mortar fire, have tanks and so on, but these fighters would. So even in a case where there's total asymmetry between the two sides, it's very difficult to take territory. The United States military has forgotten, perhaps, what happened in the early days of 2003. When the US advanced north from Kuwait, this is in the invasion in 2003, there was a massive sandstorm, and the US armed forces were blocked. They bombed the living daylights out of Baghdad, also out of Najaf and so on. But the actual troop movement was stopped by a sandstorm, and that lasted for, I don't know, 20 some hours. And after that, the progress was slow. Yes, the Iraqi army collapsed. But that was interesting. They collapsed, but then they reappeared as the insurgency. In other words, they may not have collapsed. They may have thrown off their uniforms, and come back to fight. It's not easy to win a war. It's not easy. And I find it interesting, Rania. I'm not a military expert, but I occasionally put on mainstream US channels to see these things, and you see these military experts talking about this war as if war is easy. These are people with experience from Iraq and so on. They are so highly either paid to say whatever they have to say, or they have amnesia. They've forgotten how difficult war is, and how difficult. I watched a person who had experience in Afghanistan talk as if, the Russians are being defeated in Ukraine. And I'm thinking, at the time, the war in Ukraine was only a month long. And I was like, are you joking? I mean, you got clobbered by the Taliban for over 20 years. This is just a month. I mean, and also the Russians are not using air power in the same way as the US did. Interesting thing to consider, the Russian Air Force, which has the capacity, has not pulverized Kiev. The United States pulverized Baghdad, but the Russians are not bombing Kiev. Now, this might also have to do with a kind of odd kind of racism that the Russians don't want to pulverize, fellow Slavs or whatever. I don't know. I'm not speculating about it more than that, because the US brutally bombed Baghdad. I mean, anybody who went to Baghdad the year after, in 2004, you saw a destroyed, devastated city. Large parts of the city had been bombed. This is not happening in Kiev. So the same military experts on CBS and NBC and MSNBC, they're not talking about the fact that the Russians are fine. They are bombing things. Hospitals have been bombed. There are legitimate criticisms, war crimes, even, legitimate. I think hospital is hit for whatever reason. That's a war crime. Whether Israelis hit it in Gaza or the Russians hit it in Ukraine. So, but they are not pulverizing Kiev. They are not pulverizing Kharkiv. That's interesting. What's going on here?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And also, I think, Russia from the beginning stated its goals in a very vague way so that it can move the goalposts if it needs to. And of course, now it's really focusing on the East, like you mentioned. I just very quickly wanted to share this headline because it would be a shame not to. Just given it's like comical, but also very serious. So this headline from the Times says Azov Battalion drops neo-Nazi symbol exploited by Russian propagandists. I mean, there's so much to say about this headline, but I raised this because Vijay, I had you on a few months ago when this war started, and one of the topics that we discussed was the issue of all of these weapons that we're sending to Ukraine. Whose hands are they going to end up in? How is it potentially going to kind of like breathe new life into the global far right movement? We know that Ukraine and the Azov Battalion in particular has been a sort of inspiration for some on the global far right, including the white supremacist shooter in New Zealand a few years ago. And Azov Battalion has been called a neo-Nazi organization, even by mainstream media outlets, which seem to have forgotten that now. Now they're calling it literally, it's Russian propaganda to point out that Azov Battalion is neo-Nazi, to the point where they're going to get rid of their neo-Nazi symbol. I mean, this headline's incredible. But I'm just curious, very briefly, your thoughts on this headline and on that broader threat that, or the potential for like the blowback that we might see from this war. I mean, $40 billion in weapons. Imagine where those could end up.
Yeah, first I just want to say that Tom Ball is a young man, used to live in Russia. He's a young reporter for the Times in England, which is a terrible newspaper. I don't want to put this on Tom Ball because writers don't write headlines. Headline is written by a sub writer, whatever. Okay, what a headline! I mean,
just
to send this back to rewrite, which is, I think, legit. I would perhaps put this as Azov Battalion drops neo-Nazi symbol because it is embarrassed by it. Could be more clear. It is embarrassed by it. Or Azov Battalion drops neo-Nazi symbol to make it easier for the West to send it weapons or something like that, rather than exploited by Russian propagandists. I mean, imagine a headline that says that the Waffen SS drops neo-Nazi symbol because it was being exploited by British propagandists. I mean, imagine, or exploited by Churchill. Imagine that. It's so
like
ludicrous.
an onion. It's an onion headline. It's like an onion headline.
Super ludicrous, and I don't know what to say. This is like PBS running a story where they were interviewing a mayor, small town mayor in Ukraine, and behind him he had a portrait of Stefan Bandera. Now, what was interesting about what PBS did was PBS producers and editors knew that the Bandera portrait was a problem. It's not that they had no idea who he was or they neglected. They blurred the portrait. So they continued with the interview. They ran the interview talking to this guy as if he's like a big democratic figure. But behind him, the portrait of Bandera was blurred, which meant that they knew what they were doing. I find this so cynical. When the dust begins to settle, will these media outlets at all come to consider what they've done? Look at the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times never really went back and did a proper assessment of its work, helping the Bush administration, that's George W. Bush, lead the US public to war against Iraq. Judith Miller was sent into ignominy. But that's not fair. You can't say that Judith Miller, who ran all those so called tech stories about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you can't say Judith Miller is to blame. Why should this one woman take the blame for an entire institution? Editors should have resigned. The paper should have been shut down, for being an accessory to a war crime. Why
Yeah.
war crime? Again, the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan called the US attack on Iraq a war crime. He didn't say the US conducted war crimes here, there, and everywhere. He said the war is a war crime. New York Times is an accessory to a war crime, but they never really came to terms with that. And neither will the Times of London. I doubt it very much. PBS. I mean, for God's sake, you blurred the picture of Bandera. That means you knew he's a bilious person. Why didn't you, in the story, have the reporter ask the mayor, listen, why do you have a portrait of Stefan Bandera above you? Let him tell you. Let's hear from him. That's journalism. Maybe he'll say, look, I'm uncomfortable with Bandera being a fascist, but I'm a Ukrainian patriot, and Bandera. That's an interesting storyline. Let's hear him justify Bandera. Maybe he is uncomfortable with Bandera having joined forces with the fascists. Could be.
And maybe
Let's
he's not. And
well,
maybe
it
he's
may not be,
not.
but you have to
Yeah.
first, as a journalist, you have to first ask him rather than just. In fact, they did a disservice to this man by blurring the picture because they made it seem automatic that he's a Nazi supporter and then didn't want to bring that up in the story. In fact, they did him a disservice. He should sue PBS for saying, well, why didn't you ask me? Why have a portrait of Stefan Bandera? So the news media has been so ugly, Rani. I feel in a way a little tender towards Tom Ball because the stories are typically mediocre. There's nothing worse or better, and one doesn't want the whole Twitter verse to pile on to one person as the problem. The problem is the
Right.
institution of the Western media.
That's a really good point. And that's very generous to poor Tom Ball, who definitely did not write that headline, I'm assuming. And I want to get to one more aspect of the Ukraine-Russia war before I kind of zoom out to the rest of the world, because it's hard to remember the rest of the world exists when the entire media apparatus is acting like it's only Ukraine that exists, which is how it's kind of been these last few months. But this is actually more about Russia than Ukraine. Russia is being sanctioned by the West right now in this sort of maximum pressure style campaign that was supposed to sink its economy. But so far, we've seen the ruble's actually valued higher than it was before the war. And I guess, my question for you is, why do you think that is? I've seen this argument, and you kind of alluded to this. I've seen this argument that the West underestimates the actual worth of the Russian economy, as well as to some degree the Chinese economy. But with the Russian economy, it's so heavy in commodities that are needed for basic survival, like oil and grain, and you mentioned precious metals. While the value of Western economies is actually inflated because we put so much value on things like finance and big tech, which at the end of the day, they don't actually produce anything like of real value for people's basic survival. Whereas, oil and grain we actually need to survive physically. We don't need Netflix to survive physically to like make it to the next day. So I guess, why do you think that the Russian economy has so far survived this almost unprecedented economic onslaught by the most powerful countries in the world? And do you think this new oil embargo that I opened with will change that?
Well, there's a range of reasons. There's not one reason. The first is that, in a way, the Russians had begun to prepare for this. They had built up quite large surpluses of their in their external account, so that they had money. Their sovereign funds were quite well endowed. They'd already begun to do trade in other currencies than the dollar. The Russians and the Chinese, for instance, had integrated their economy and were using a combination renminbi and the ruble. They had actually de-dollarized to a certain extent. Russia has also integrated its natural gas and oil, exploration and development with economies that were linked to the West, like Japan or India and so on. So it had prepared for this in a way by building a kind of infrastructure that circumvented the need for the West, or in case there were sanctions. So that's one. I think that's an important one. Secondly, you're quite right that Russia is very rich. All the things you said, but also gold. It has big gold holdings, one of the largest gold producers in the world. Um, and for all those reasons, it's hard to cut off Russia from the rest of the world. So even U.S. allies like Japan, India. I mean, the United States just convened a meeting of the Quad with in Japan with the Japanese, the new Australian government, India, and all of them came there. But meanwhile, Australia's principal trading partner is not the United States, it's China, which is firmly integrated with Russia. Japan continues to invest, even despite the sanctions, continues to invest in Sakhalin 2, which is the big natural gas field on Sakhalin Island in Russia. India has made it very clear it's going to continue to buy energy and other things from China. And in fact, India's government-run energy company ONGC is looking to buy oil fields and natural gas fields that had been held by European and US companies, which are trying to divest their ownership in those fields as a consequence of sanctions. So, for that reason, this integration of Eurasia I talked about, it's very hard to get out of. These countries understand that, we're in a moment of complexity, of contradictions, not of certainty. So when the US tells India, you got to do this, India says, look, we can't. We're buying Russian crude at a great discount. And that's the last thing. Russia, very cleverly, because it built up these surpluses, has been able to sell crude oil at a discount. So countries around the world are lining up to buy discounted oil at a time of major fuel and food inflation. If you're getting a discount in oil prices, you're going to queue up. And so the Russians are selling their oil at an incredible discount. Why wouldn't you buy it at a discount instead of allowing mass starvation and then protests, as we've seen in Sri Lanka? Countries, and also to some extent in Pakistan, but mainly Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is the front line right now of this COVID pandemic, Ukraine, and the kind of general turbulence of capitalism crisis. I mean, it's really in the middle of it all, and it's only going to get worse for Sri Lanka. But other countries are saying, "Hey, listen, fine, Blinken and Nod and all you other people in the US, you can tell us whatever you want in terms of your needs." But our people have needs. And, I was just in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, no radical sitting there in the presidency in South Africa, made it very clear that, look, this Ukraine war, it's not our war. Therefore, we are not getting involved. We are going to continue with our relations with Russia. India has made it very clear, as I said, stunningly, Japan, which is a group of 7 countries. It's a country that belongs to the OECD. It's part of the inner circle of the United States, war planning against China and so on. The Japanese are like, sorry, guys, our investment companies are going to, and these are government investment companies, are going to continue to invest in Russian energy fields because guess what? We need to continue to import Russian energy, even though Japan only imports about 6% of its crude and a little more than 6% of natural gas from Russia. Despite that, that's still a lot. I guess you need to understand statistics to know that anything above 1% is a lot. I mean, if you cut off 6%, we're talking about inflation, in some countries at 7, 8%. There 7% is a lot. So 6% is not easy to substitute. Germany at 30% reliance on Russian energy is going to be seriously damaged if it actually, and I don't believe they will, because remember, the ban is on seaborne energy. It's not clear that this is going to include the pipeline energy. Let's see what exactly happens.
Yeah, it's, I guess, the countries that rely on the seaport energy needs, which I'm not sure which ones they are. I suspect one might be Hungary. Maybe no, actually no, because Hungary is like landlocked. We'll see. But yeah,
I
there is
think, by
hustling
the
to
way,
be.
Rania, I think this EU thing is entirely meaningless propaganda, because
Well, they
most of
better
the
hope so
countries
for
get it through
themselves.
pipelines. Yeah.
Well, they better hope so for themselves because the news was reporting that this makes up 2/3 of their energy needs in the or 2/3 of the Russian gas that they get in the EU is through the seaports. But again, it's unclear like how that splits up by country, and obviously that doesn't apply to Germany so much because of the pipeline gas. But you mentioned something really important, and that's like the food. You mentioned food insecurity in Sri Lanka in particular. There has been this really concerted effort by the EU in particular, but also the US, almost like a PR campaign to blame Russia for this growing food insecurity. And I'm not saying Russia's blameless. Like, obviously, first of all, you've reported on food insecurity before this war existed. So we already have food insecurity in the developing world. But obviously, this war has made it worse because Ukraine and Russia are like the world's breadbasket. Uh, that said, sanctions on Russia are always left out by all of these European and American politicians who are talking about it's Russia's fault, it's Russia's fault. Sanctions are driving up fuel and food prices, and it's impacting the world in such a dramatic way. You mentioned Sri Lanka. Uh, I know this is a huge shift from what we're talking about, but maybe not so much. Why are there suddenly these mass protests in Sri Lanka? Why are there suddenly these horrible food and fuel shortages in Sri Lanka? The country's like declaring bankruptcy, defaulting on debt for the first time. What's going on in Sri Lanka, and is it related to the war in Ukraine?
Well, firstly, Sri Lanka is ruled by a kleptocratic family, the Rajapaksa family. In fact, two members of the family headed the two highest offices in government until the crisis, tumbled at their doorstep, literally, because there were protests and then there was a lot of political thuggery. Their party members going and beating up people, killing people, burning houses, and so on. Um, the Economist ran a headline saying that the economic crisis has become a political crisis. That was how they fashioned it. Now, there are again many authors to the problem in Sri Lanka, but I would put part of the blame or considerable amount of the blame on this ruling family and the ruling party in Sri Lanka. Some of this goes to very poor management in the short term of their finances. Some of it goes to long term mismanagement of the country. I mean, Sri Lanka is an importer of milk, not milk, but powdered milk. In other words, when you go and drink tea in many places, you get powdered milk, not milk. It doesn't produce milk domestically. The milk lobby, the powdered milk lobby, the import lobby is so strong that it has prevented the even the private sector to develop a domestic dairy industry. So there's enormous reliance on importing all kinds of things. It's in that sense it faces a long-term crisis in terms of sovereignty of its economy. But I also want to say that we have to understand that Sri Lanka went through a great period of political civil war, military instability, and so on in the country. Real terrible war that involved the human rights violations against the Tamil people toward the end of the war, and so on. Anyway, didn't have a chance to really breathe after that. There was some hope for Sri Lanka when Chinese investment came on hand, and Sri Lanka, in a sense, well, actually joined the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese were keen to develop a port in Hambantota, a major port for the Indian Ocean. It's part of the Chinese string of pearls strategy of building a set of ports in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so there was a bunch of different bids for the port. And an independent assessment was made of the financing for the port. The assessor came and said something interesting. Assessor said, look, let's get preliminary financing, build part of the port, open it, let it get running, start making a profit. The moment it starts making a profit, take the second tranche of financing and expand the port. And then you can have a more stable way to pay back the loan. No, the Sri Lankan government, I think, quite criminally decided to demand the entire financing. And the financing came from Chinese, part private, part government financiers, who also warned that, look, we don't want to give you the whole tranche because this is going against the assessor. Sri Lankan government insisted. And actually, that's what put their public external financing in some real grave situation, that they made a big mistake. initially this was the example given of Chinese so-called debt trap
Yeah.
diplomacy. But people who've looked at this carefully, including two scholars who published a long piece in the Atlantic magazine, said that, look, this is actually a problem of the Sri Lankan government. That they were even warned by the Chinese, don't actually take both tranches. They insisted. Now, if they insist, you can't say, no, we're not giving it to you. I suppose they could have, but they ended up giving it to them. So this is all predating the crisis that took place. Now you have the rising inflation, the tide of inflation hitting the island, which has a problem of the sovereignty of the economy anyway, importing even things like powdered milk. United States has a shortage of infant milk supply. It's a big scandal in the United States, although not made as much a scandal as it should be. But there's a
Yeah.
shortage of powdered milk in the US. Imagine now, a country like Sri Lanka, which has bidding capacity to bid for limited supply of powdered milk, is not that great. That means they're not getting enough supply of even things like milk, which means prices go up. There's a huge demand and supply mismatch in the Sri Lankan economy. So all of this happens now. The Rajapaksa government, in great distress, turns not to Beijing. And that's interesting because it could have gone back to now the People's Bank of China in order to do a currency swap. People's Bank of China have been doing currency swaps. They would have done a sort of, swap with the Sri Lankan currency and Chinese currency without the dollar. And then you buy essentially renminbi from China, and you can go to the open market and sell the renminbi to earn dollars if you'd like. But you don't have to actually buy dollars because that's much harder. You have to get somebody to accept your currency for dollars. That's not going to happen. People are accepting renminbi for dollars. But anyway, the People's Bank of China has been doing these currency swaps. It did it for Argentina. It could have done it for Sri Lanka, but no. Rajapaksa, under immense political pressure from the West, has gone to the World Bank. The World Bank has provided a $700 million loan. And now it gets interesting. The $700 million loan has come, but the country manager of the World Bank, Mr. Chio Kanda, essentially said something quite interesting. Said that, well, look, we're now going to go and talk to the Asian Development Bank, the IMF, and others, and we are going to, and this is Kanda's language, we are going to repurpose Sri Lanka's loans, meaning wean Sri Lanka away from Chinese financing. It's extraordinary that in the middle of a major crisis in Sri Lanka, this is yet again an opportunity for direct confrontation of the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and the IMF, on behalf of the US Treasury Department against China. That's like the principal issue, not the needs of the Sri Lankan people. I mean, if you're actually going to put the needs of the Sri Lankan people at the forefront, all kinds of financing should come into the picture, to help Sri Lanka tide through the crisis. But instead of that, again, we are seeing Sri Lanka being drawn into this Cold War or whatever kind of war that the United States is imposing, where the World Bank comes in and says, we are going to actually wean you away from Chinese financing, make you reliant on the World Bank, 700 million from the World Bank as a preliminary source of funds, and then the IMF is going to come with more. But listen, we know that the IMF always shows up with its own ideas about what should happen to an economy. So beware, people of Sri Lanka. Beware of the Rajapaksas on the one hand, and then beware of the IMF on the other.
Well said. I mean, this is so emblematic of just the way that this US Western obsession with dominating the world in these moments of like Cold War actually end up destroying the world, starving the world in all these various ways. We even saw Biden say last week after this, or during this like summit, this Asia summit or whatever, or his Asia tour, excuse me, saying the US will in fact intervene militarily if China invades Taiwan. We saw this Politico article also last week that showed how US officials are actually encouraging the Taiwanese government to emulate Ukraine for a future war with China. From what you're talking about with Sri Lanka, obviously that's not a hot war, but it's a kind of Cold War playing out in this smaller country, the smaller, weaker country. It's kind of like we're just entering this era of proxy wars, cold wars all around the world. And this is kind of a weird pivot, but I really want to get your take on this because I think you have wise words on almost all of these things. But, I don't know how much attention you pay to fights on the internet, on Twitter in particular. I hope not much because it's a huge waste of time. Unfortunately, I tend to waste my time a little too much paying attention to those feuds, but there is this ongoing feud about, over some people referring to Republicans as anti-interventionist because a handful of them in Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, have vocally opposed sending weapons to Ukraine, while not one Democrat has opposed this. Surprisingly, not even Bernie Sanders or any, a single member of the squad. They all voted for this $40 billion, aid package of weapons to Ukraine. But as I see it, Vijay, this handful of Republicans are mostly just opportunistically attacking Biden, right? Like if Trump was the one in charge, I doubt any of them, except for maybe like Rand Paul, would be voting against sending weapons to Ukraine. They would be fully on board. Plus, that faction of Republicans is also so staunchly for war with China that they think we're fighting the wrong war against Russia, that we should be fighting against China. All that said, obviously, we don't endorse the Democratic Party at Breakthrough News, but I'm wondering if maybe you could explain why Republicans shouldn't be viewed as anti-war in this moment, despite the fact that some of them may seem like it. Because at the end of the day, neither party is anti-war, right? I assume you agree with that.
Well, firstly, I will be honest with you. I have not followed this particular kerfuffle on Twitter. I mean, I follow other kerfuffles on Twitter. Some of them are too embarrassing for me to admit in public, but so be it. I mean, I also watch very strange videos online, so it's not like I'm immune to the madness of the internet. On the other hand, let's be frank, okay? You said it. I mean, these are opportunists, but also these are racist, horrible people, and one must never ally with them. I was having a discussion with somebody several months ago about, they were saying, oh, you should go on Chris Tucker's show.
Tucker Carlson.
Or Tucker Carlson. Whatever.
I love that you just called him Chris Tucker.
I don't know
That's
these
beautiful.
people much. I never watched their programs. But I do know, from whatever I'm told, that these are white supremacist type people, and I would never want to. I mean, the only time I went on Fox News was when Bill O'Reilly sent Jesse Waters to my home when I was teaching in Trinity. The day after Osama bin Laden was killed, I happened to have said on a radio program that I felt that there were some serious international law problems with the killing, because now India might just send, a battalion across the border to kill some Kashmiri in Lahore, and that's appalling. It could start. I made that comment. Bill O'Reilly decided I was to be the pinhead, and he tried to get me on his show. I refused to go. So he sent his attack dog, Jesse Waters, to my home, scared my children, followed me around when I drove around. And then eventually he got me on camera and they ran it, and I was the pinhead for the week and whatever. That's the only time I have been on Fox News. I would never go on that channel. It is a bilious, abhorrent channel. I don't want to, quote unquote, reach its audience, frankly. I think that's a ridiculous thing. I'm so opposed to that. Same way, it's ridiculous to assume that, Marjorie Greene and people like that are in this on some moral footing. Now, okay, they may oppose a war you might have common cause on just that. I actually don't think they oppose the war. I think you're very right. They oppose Biden. They don't oppose this war. They oppose Biden. And I think people forget the plot on that. When Trump was the president, these people were right behind him when he bombed a section of Afghanistan with the mother of all bombs. And then the US and Afghan government of the time prevented journalists from going to see what had happened there. And my friends tell me it's still hard to go there to see and to write a story about the devastation. Entire villages were in the so-called kill zone of that bomb. I didn't see any of these Republicans taking a quote-unquote anti-interventionist stand. I don't buy it. I think that these people are entirely partisan, and also they are white supremacists. To some extent, it's that old idea. They don't believe maybe that Slavs are lesser. Some people seem to have that view, but they do believe, like the Ukrainian high official, and the reporters from US news channels who talked about blue-eyed children and blonde hair and so on, I think they have that view, and they may want to crush China for daring to stand up on its 2 feet as a country, and say, let's use Russia against China. Remember, there was a debate that has been going on in, again, the US for a long time, whether to ally with China against Russia or to ally with Russia against China. Henry Kissinger has always said ally with China against Russia, but others have taken the opposite position. And these are not credible people. They are not to be. They are, I'm not going to hold hands with them and lift up my hands and say we are all against war together.
No, I appreciate your thoughts on that, and I also wanted to get your thought on one more thing that I think is really important. It's funny when I have you on, it's always to talk about the international perspective on all these things happening outside the U.S., but now so much is happening inside the U.S. Uh, and that we have to comment on those things. And that is the fact that there was yet another school shooting in the U.S. But of course, like the way it's covered in the media, it's largely framed in this culture war way, right? Where Democrats blame the lack of gun control, that's impossible to pass because of Republicans, which isn't wrong. But then Republicans come up with all these crazy solutions on how to deal with this, like we need to arm teachers, which is insane. And then everyone blames mental health and bullying, which, probably play a role here. That said, I feel like it runs deeper because, I'm talking to you from the Middle East right now, which is drowning in weapons. It's drowning in guns, all kinds of social problems, as well as economic inequality and poverty that's like far more severe than anything in the US. You could even argue that, like, you want to talk about mental health. I think this entire region has like post-traumatic it's like a traumatized region. Like there is no mental illness here in a way because it's just everyone suffers from it because of the conditions here. Yet people aren't mowing down children in school. Yes, there is violence and there's war, but it's like violence with a purpose, like it's violence with an ideology. It doesn't make it okay, but it's different than the sort of mass shooter situation that you see in the US. Like, what, I guess my question from you, because you've traveled so much, you've covered so many different countries, why do you think the US is uniquely exceptional when it comes to mass shootings, like what we saw last week?
Well, a couple of things, Rania, and I'm not, again, able to talk more on this because I really don't. I feel this to be just an appalling situation. It's a civilizational crisis for the United States, and people need to really deeply reflect on it and not just jump into talking points. Um, a couple of things. One is, I think it's true that there are lots of mass shootings, and that these are take place sometimes at malls, sometimes at concerts like in Las Vegas, but these are not mass shootings. These are principally school shootings. That's interesting to me. Is it a gun problem or is it a school problem? Um, I mean, why aren't they, like, every few months we hear about somebody going into a school and shooting, much less going into a mall or into a movie theater or other public places, into a bank. I don't hear about bank shootings and corporate office shootings and Starbucks shootings, and it's school shootings. There's a school problem here, and I don't really know much more than that. It's just an observation. Why do these people, often with deep mental health problems, go to their schools, sometimes where they studied, and then shoot people up?
Mhm.
Do we have a problem with the way in which children are socialized? Is there a deep problem of bullying, which is then brought to the surface by gunfire? I mean, bullying is a terribly torturous thing. Those children at Columbine, for instance, the atmosphere in the school was fairly toxic, militarized atmosphere, masculine atmosphere. There's a broader cultural issue here where a lot of children, even in the child in Connecticut who was suffering from serious mental health problems, went back to his school where I think his mother taught, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
There is a problem of it seems to me, there's a problem of child rearing in countries like the United States. There's a problem of the kind of toxic masculinity of the culture, of the allowance for bullying. And also there's the disregard of teachers. There's so much anti-teacher rhetoric, Teachers are not being allowed to choose books to teach by themselves. They're not trusted to do all that. It's extraordinary that the Republicans are saying armed teachers. You're not allowing teachers to choose the curriculum, but you want to give them guns. This disparagement of public schools at the same time as this toxic culture that has grown up. I think this in combination must be understood. So you got to put school shootings alongside teen suicide. Put these two together, look at the data. I think it's quite shocking. The high level of teen suicide is really part of the discussion about mass shootings in schools. This is a problem about children being raised in schools, not just about guns. It's not really
That's
about guns at all.
That's a really good point. Actually, I had never even thought about it that way. That's an excellent point, and I wish we had like experts looking into these things. Sadly, a lot of that is prevented from happening by the gun industry. But I know I'm pivoting all over the place here, but this is more just to kind of like get to maybe perhaps a positive note, a note of inspiration, or an ending of inspiration. I wanted to raise the results of of Colombia's recent election. You have the left-wing candidate Gustavo Petro, who won the first round of the presidential elections by quite a lot, though he didn't win completely. So now it will go to a second round. But he'll be competing against this far right, like 100 millionaire oligarch Rodolfo Hernandez, who's this very Trump-like figure. And which I think, is significant. I'm sure you would agree in a place like Colombia, which has been in the hands of the right for so long, that a left winger could do this well in an election like this. But I raise this because it seems like everywhere where things are awful, which is most places, and a popular leftist emerges, which I wish happened more often, we also see this parallel emergence of a far right Trump figure. I'm not trying to like say everywhere is the same, but you do see this phenomenon happening over and over again, whether it's the sort of Bernie Sanders versus Trump sort of thing, or whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil, or on and on and on. There's places where we're seeing like a recurrence of this kind of dynamic playing out. And so I guess I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on why it is that there's so many Trump-like figures and not enough left figures, and why does it seem, maybe this is more of like a pessimistic note than a positive note, but I feel like you'll turn it into something positive. Why does it feel like there is no alternative? Like, we know we have this horrible system. It's so unequal. It's so disastrous. It's causing so many crises, whether planetary, environmental, whether it's mental health, whether it's, physical health, it's whether it's food insecurity, and on. It's causing so many awful crises. There seems to be no ability of the system to address any of these crises. It seems like, this almost collapse of the capitalist world order, but without an alternative. And that's really disturbing. So I guess my question is two-pronged. Why is it everywhere where anything is happening in response to this, you have a far right and far left emerging? And then also, why does it feel like there is no real left alternative on a global scale?
So, I mean, I'm glad you started with Colombia. You could just go down south to Brazil, where likelihood of President Lula coming back to power is very high, and so on. I mean, the first thing is that in most of the countries of the world, liberalism has collapsed as a political platform. Social democracy has collapsed. That ground that the liberals held, where they balanced in a way support for private property and capitalism with social relief, with ensuring that there was some kind of healthcare system set up and some kind of relief for the poorest and the indigent and people who suffered from various forms of crises, one after the other, loss of jobs, or perhaps various forms of disability. That space of liberalism was killed off by austerity politics, by essentially neoliberalism. That essentially killed off liberalism. And with the death of liberalism, elites went, I mean, almost they frog marched to the right. And you saw not just Trump, because it's in a way not fair to just say that it's somebody as obscene as Trump. But even in the United States, even the Democratic Party has basically moved far away from liberalism, far away. Biden's policies are hardly liberal. I mean, They're hardly going out there and lifting up relief for people and so on. At most he wanted to push an infrastructural bill, and a big investment in infrastructure, but that's to save capitalism. That's not necessarily about helping people deeply in need, shoring up social relief and so on. So the death of liberalism to some extent accounts for the elite moving toward the right. That's one side of it. The other is that as a consequence of the death of liberalism, particularly social democracy, which was the left flank of liberalism, left forces have had to come in and fill that gap. And the left, instead of spending the time to build the ramparts of a new world, trade unions, people's organizations and so on, has had to fight to actually defend the modest relief opportunities under capitalism. And that's why an entire generation went from the left into NGOs. So many good thinking people go into NGOs. NGOization in a way was the emergence of a kind of private sector social democracy. And that it brought the left to the center, because the right, was basically dragging the center to obscene places in the right wing. And I think that accounts for some of it. Look, in Colombia, which is a country which has never really had a liberal center, it's always been a far right country. It was the mass demonstrations led by groups like Congreso de Pueblos and so on from 2019, 2018, 2019, mass demonstrations against the government's deceit regarding the peace deal with the FARC, the government's move to austerity and so on. Those mass demonstrations, and then the demonstrations of the Afro-Colombian population against the assassination of social movement leaders. I mean, let's put on the record that Gustavo Petro's running mate, Francia Marquez, is a black woman, an Afro-Colombian woman. The two of them brought together this major social upheaval. Plus, sections of the elite in Colombia, the young elite, don't want to live in a military state. They would like a more modern society. Petro, like Gustavo Boric of Chile, is not a far left candidate. I mean, these are center left people with center left objectives, which is much to the better than these bilious far right people. People on the left who complain, well, Boric is a sellout or whatever. Look, imagine the options in the country. You have to build the left. You can't just inherit a country, and that's going to take time. One hopes that in this new cycle, Rania, social democracy will assert itself so that the left can go back to the task of the left, which is to build the ramparts of the future.
That's very well said. I wish I had more time to ask you. I'll have to do like another episode. You mentioned NATO and Africa. That actually deserves its own episode. We'll have to come back for that. But Vijay, I want to thank you for once again giving me so much of your time talking about all these extremely important issues. It's always such a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks a lot, Rania. Yeah, thanks.